Welcome once again to The Radical Imagination. I'm your host, Jim Vrettos. I'm a sociologist who's taught at John Jay College and Yeshiva University here in New York. The geographical definitions of the South Bronx have evolved and are disputed. But as its name implies, it comprises neighborhoods in the southern part of the Bronx, such as the Concourse, Mott Haven, Melrose, and Port Morris. By the 1960s, the South Bronx was seen to extend up to the Cross Bronx Expressway, encompassing the neighborhoods of Hunts Point, Morrisana, Highbridge, Belmont, Castle Hill, Crotona, Park East, Longwood, and Soundview. Originally populated by an influx of German and Irish immigrants by the 30s and 40s, Jews made up over 55% of the population of the South Bronx. The Bronx itself was considered the Jewish borough, and at its peak in 1930 was 49% Jewish. After World War II, as white flight accelerated and migration of ethnic and racial minorities continued, the South Bronx went from being two-thirds non-Hispanic white in 1950 to being two-thirds black or Puerto Rican in 1960. The area traditionally has been a place for working-class families. Its image as a poverty-ridden area developed in the latter part of the 20th century. By the 1970s, the Bronx experienced some of the worst ravages of urban decay, with the loss of 300,000 residents and the destruction of entire city blocks worth of buildings. The media attention brought the South Bronx into the national spotlight. Politicians like Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan visited the area and declared them disaster areas. Charlotte Street, at the time of Carter's visit, had been so ravaged that part of it had been taken off official city maps in 1974. Reagan declared in 1980 that he had not seen anything like that since London after the Blitz. The Bronx is burning. The NYPD's 41st Precinct Station, housed on Simpson Street, became famously known as Fort Apache, the Bronx. By 1980, the 41st was renamed the Little House on the Prairie, as fully two-thirds of the original residents had fled, leaving the precinct house as the sole building on Simpson Street that had not been abandoned or burnt out. The 1987 novel and movie The Bonfire of the Vanities by Tom Wolfe portrayed the South Bronx as a nightmare world not to be entered by middle or upper class whites. We are so proud and thrilled to have on the Radical Imagination today the two directors and producers of a groundbreaking, harrowing, and heart-wrenching documentary on its history of the South Bronx. It's called Decade of Fire, and in contrast, it tells the truth of a devastatingly beautiful narrative of the vibrant and supportive community where residents who lived in the South Bronx during the 50s and 60s grew up, worked, and raised their families. This was a mecca of diverse cultures and people of widely varying ethnicity that not only harmoniously coexisted, but flourished and thrived side by side under the most challenging of conditions. It's a testimony to the human spirit, and even with some of the nostalgia thrown in, the Decade of Fire makes the South Bronx still seem like an incredible place to have been at that time. So thank you so very, very much for being here and making this monumental film. Vivian, Vasquez, and Gretchen Hildebran. Welcome to the Radical Imagination.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gretchen and Vivian, for being here, for making this incredible film, and tell our audience how this all got started. How did this vision happen? You lived in the South Bronx, correct, Vivian?
I grew up in the old Lincoln in the South Bronx.
The old Lincoln being?
On Southern Boulevard
Okay.
near 143rd Street,
Okay.
not the new Lincoln. It's people from back in the day call it the old Lincoln.
Okay.
So I grew up in the South Bronx on Leggett and Fox until I
Okay.
was about 17, 18 years old.
So how was it? How was it living there? What did you experience? And How did this come to be manifested in this incredible documentary?
When I was little, growing up in the South Bronx, I thought was wonderful, normal, and then it got a little scary. But as a child, I remember my neighbors being African American. Betty was an Irish woman in my building. My mother's best friend upstairs was Jewish. The principal was Albert G. Oliver of our elementary school. We sang the Black National Anthem, Lift Every Voice and Sing, along with the Star Spangled Banner. We sang La Borinqueña, which was the Puerto Rican national anthem. I remember my family and my mom and my dad being part of a community in my building. I literally was able to travel to the next apartment, upstairs, downstairs, kind of barefooted, ask for rice, sugar, ask to eat, and it was just quite all right. By the time I was in middle school, things had changed in the South Bronx. I began to notice, and there was just a greater awareness of danger.
What years
fires.
were these? What years were these?
Well, I was born in 1963, so that by the early 70s and the mid 70s, the South Bronx was a firestorm. You can talk. I talked to my sister or other people that we grew up with, and I remember the fires during the day. My sister remembers the fires at night. We just knew that there were fires all the time, and that there were abandoned buildings all the time.
So this is
we had abandoned buildings. We had, fires, lots of sirens going off, and we lived that way for a very long time.
As a young kid, you were wondering what was going on here, what had happened.
Quite frankly, I think that for many of us, we thought it was normal. I thought it was normal. I played in rubble with lots of bricks and glass, and got bitten by dogs, and my sister got bitten by a dog. I thought it was normal to live that way. It didn't seem out of the ordinary. I mean, we kind of knew something was going on because whenever we turned on the television to the Brady Bunch, we realized that our lives were not the Brady Bunch. And so, I left the neighborhood, went to college, came back, began to raise a family in the Bronx, began to work in the Bronx, and thought that I had left that part of my life behind me. Although I always worked for community-based organizations, serving the community, I don't think that, I sort of took a very serious critical look or an analysis of what happened in the neighborhood.
Until
the early 2000s, where when my coworker, Julia Allen, who happens to be our co-producer in the film, and I began to work together, and we started to write a curriculum for students about the history of the Bronx. And she took over, writing this curriculum. And the curriculum was rejected because it was too one-sided, it was radical.
You tried to introduce the history.
We were trying to introduce history. We were trying to introduce,
as you saw it,
we introduced graffiti as a way of young people expressing their frustration at the time. We tried to introduce hip hop that came out of the Bronx as a way that young people began to express their frustration, and it wasn't accepted. So we never really got to teach it. Nevertheless, my colleague Julia kept asking questions like, really? You guys had to sleep with your shoes on at times? Or tell me what happened. And so the more I talked about growing up in the Bronx, the more she encouraged me to talk more about what happened in the Bronx, and made me realize that those things weren't normal, that it was kind of like, wow, that happened to you, Vivian, it's not normal, it's not good. And so eventually, she introduced me to Gretchen.
How did Gretchen? Okay. Ms. Allen,
Gretchen, who is a professional filmmaker.
I see.
And got us together. It was sort of a blind date, and whether or not I would be interested in filming some of our friends and learning about the Bronx, and we looked at each other, and after about a half hour, we were like, okay, let's go for it.
Thank goodness. And so Gretchen, you heard this story, and Vivian becomes the main character in the story, and
that didn't happen right immediately. I mean, honestly, we started working on this as a shorter project. We didn't really know where it was going to go. I had just moved to New York. I was learning about this history for the first time. As a kid, I had seen images of the South Bronx, but I had no idea what they were about.
We're going to show that in a couple of minutes. This was even shown on the World Series. I think that you have this in the documentary too.
Exactly.
1977. But yeah, so you saw these images, but you were from California. You were in California.
Well, I moved here from California. I grew up in Vermont.
Okay.
So I didn't really understand what was happening in cities at that time at all. And, but I've always loved New York, and I was, kind of thrilled to get a chance to understand where I was living in this very complex and city with such a kind of tangled history. And I just really appreciated that Vivian, she invited me over she had a number of friends who just sat around and talked about what they remembered, and that's was our starting place.
Well, here's a little bit of that tangled history. In 1977, the World Series game is being played at Yankee Stadium in the Bronx, and let's cut to the clip here with Howard Cosell talking about the World Series, and they see the fire in the background. 1977 World Series.
That is a live picture. And obviously a major fire in a large building in the South Bronx region of New York City. That's a live picture, and obviously the fire department in the Bronx have their problem. My goodness, that's a huge place.
That's the very area where President Carter trod just a few days ago.
With one out now, 2-0.
That's a live shot again of that fire in the South Bronx that Keith called to your attention just a few moments ago. Wonder how many alarms are involved, but as Keith said, the fire department really has its work cut out for it.
Here it is, 6.
News item.
There's a couple more clips on that, but you get the idea. So here's the whole nation, middle of the World Series, become fixated with, wow, what the heck's going on in the South Bronx? And even Vermont, the dairy farms or whatever. My goodness.
My dad always watched baseball, so
so Gretchen, come on in here, look at it. Okay, anyway, so you're now involved, and you're become more and more interested in this history, the history that you try to put in the curriculum that's rejected here. And so what's the next step? How does this
Well, that's a good question. I mean, to give it a little context,
Sure.
This process started in 2008. So
Over 10 years.
Yeah, so it's a project that really came to life over the course of 10 years. And I would say for the first 3 or 4 years, we were living our lives, working other jobs, and kind of slowly trying to figure out what story we wanted to tell, because none of us are historians.
Mm-hmm.
And honestly, I don't think any of us really came to this with that much of an agenda, except maybe you want to speak
Really?
about what your intention was when we started.
Well, I think that I'm not really sure what the intention was. Right? We were just like, let's talk about the South Bronx and let's talk about the fires. But I think one of the things that happened was that Gretchen would come to the community with me. She would come back to the neighborhood with me and meet all these people that talked about how great it was to grow up in the South Bronx and how we supported each other and the fun we had. But she also heard the devastation. She also heard a lot of sad stories. I think she began to hear about the people dying, people falling into drugs, the gangs, and I think that
the negative press, right?
Well,
that was now being.
Yeah, but at the time, I think that what she was listening to, what she was entering into, was a group of old-timers who talked about the beauty of growing up in the South Bronx, but at the same time, that collective pain and the stories, the sort of the painful stories that we all share. And I think that what we began to do was sort of unravel why was it so hard, and you know, sort of looking at the fires as a way to try to describe how the fires impacted our lives. And then, you know, we began to do the research, right? And we began to learn a lot about what actually happened in the South Bronx. And so, you know, there was a collection of books and a collection of researchers that were...
Did you talk to your parents about this?
Oh, yeah. My mom is interviewed in the film.
Okay.
My dad is interviewed. My brothers and sisters were interviewed. She spent a lot of time with me and my family, and also with folks at 52 Park, which is a park where I spent a lot of time as a kid growing up. And so we began to sort of try to understand some of the context by which those fires occurred and what was going on. So we began to learn about redlining and urban renewal, and you know, we learned about firehouses. Like, I think that was one of the first things that we might have learned. Firehouses were closing at a time when there was record number of fires occurring in the Bronx. Why? Let's look at data. And so we spent time kind of unpacking some of that data.
Became a much more involved, complicated story. And but perhaps what we should do is put the clip on now, the brief clip on the trailer, so it gives us a little more of a flavor for our audience.
We grew up in rubble. We grew up with burnt out decay all over us. The South Bronx was burning down around us, and nobody seemed to know why. This is a story of what happened to my neighborhood.
Everything south of the Cross Bronx Expressway, they just let it burn, and nobody gave a damn.
Fear was everywhere, and everybody was just trying to stay quiet about what was happening.
You see streets where it was teeming with people to become a ghost town.
We had come here from the South and from Puerto Rico, searching for the American dream. Our families lived side by side in the most integrated neighborhoods in the country. But after the fires, it would all be gone. How could city government allow this to happen? Who was in charge? Why?
The South Bronx used to be a respectable Jewish neighborhood. It hasn't been bombed, it's been devastated by neglect, and the people who live here, mostly immigrants from the Deep South or Puerto Rico.
But we didn't burn the Bronx. We were the ones who stayed.
We didn't want to leave. We didn't want to go, but we didn't know how. Sometimes you need somebody to just start it.
I said, no, wait a minute. I have to make my move right now.
I made a commitment then, in December 1974, that I was going to put this building back together.
The reason we're trying to do all these things is to show an example to the rest of the people in the neighborhood that if you just try, you could make a lot better neighborhood.
This was just a taste of things to come.
But we need more money, Carter, because I think
the federal government can come in and wave a wand and do this.
Push! Why don't you push?
This story is not just about the Bronx. There are places like this in every major city in America. Places that everyone has given up on, except for us. We came from this so-called terrible place, the South Bronx. But we would never leave it behind.
Incredible. There's a lot to unpack there.
Yeah, lots of archival.
Where do we start?
Well, why don't we talk about the archival footage that you unearthed?
Sure.
Well, you are the one who dug it out of your dad's closet in Puerto Rico. So the very first shot of that trailer is of Vivian and her older brother and sister on a street in the Bronx. How old would you say you were in there?
About 3.
Really?
And so Vivian at maybe 4 years into this project, and this is, I mean, it's an interesting window into how we started out really trying to talk about history, and we found that the way that people could really relate to that story and really enter the world of the Bronx and understand it from the inside is for it to really be through Vivian's own story and her lens.
And family. And then bringing others and friends in to share.
Right. So one really important piece is that at a certain point I asked Vivian, well, did your dad ever, I had seen all these photos, but there was always kind of like more stuff coming out of the corners. And at one point I was like, did your dad ever shoot any film of you guys? And she's like, oh yeah, he was always shooting film of us. And so it turns out there's these hidden reels of Super 8 film that were in a closet in Puerto Rico.
Really?
Yeah, and I think that what was interesting is the Super 8 of the Vasquez family with all the other archival footage that places us in that same time period. So there are the fires, but there we were as well too. Here's the migration story, but there we are too.
Hanging in there and trying to flourish and trying to live and survive. And was there, you touched on some of the political, economic conditions. I mean, was there much talk about that? Wondered why are these firehouses closing? I mean, what impact was the Cross Bronx Expressway? What about redlining? I mean, there's so much going on there. The Section 8 housing, the decline in property values. I mean, this was happening all around you. White flight, polarization of the city, ethnically, racially. Was this part of the community discussion, or
I think
a little
that
later? Or?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there was a community discussion, but I certainly, as a kid, was not a part of that.
Sure.
My parents struggled to make ends meet. They worked constantly.
What did they do?
My dad worked for a furniture company on Prospect Avenue. And my mom was a homemaker until eventually she went to work as a clerk downtown on Wall Street for an insurance company. But they were always working, and we were 5. And so we went to school, were part of community events, but
your building survived.
Our building survived.
So you were able to stay, and you had that history.
We had a couple of fires in my building, but the building never came down. The buildings up on our same block fell. The 2 of our buildings fell from fire, but our building survived. But I think that we had, somewhat of an active group of tenants in our building. We had people who cleaned the building aside from our landlord and our super, and we were made responsible for the cleanliness, like even myself and the kids in the neighborhood.
Yeah, And you went
the
to
building.
school in the neighborhood?
Yeah, I went to PS 62 and IS 52, which were blocks away from on either side.
So you walked to school?
We walked to school.
Much the rubble, and what were you thinking? What were you feeling? Were you upset, scared?
I mean, I have to tell you that
normal.
It wasn't. It wasn't like, oh my God, it's so scary. It was just watch the nails. You don't want to step on a rusty nail. That was a big deal. My dad did not allow us to jump on mattresses. There were mattresses all the time.
We saw in the clip,
you know, that was just something we knew that when my dad came home from work, not to get caught jumping on a mattress. You know, we knew not to walk in certain areas at night, but it wasn't like we lived in the community. You know, we were among our neighbors, and so we.
You weren't it wasn't about panicking, but it was trying to make it as natural as possible and normal as possible.
Yeah.
Even in the face of these really difficult conditions.
Right. There were difficult conditions. I mean, there were, you know, bad things that happened to people as well. But as a kid, I think our parents worried the most. If you have my mother sitting here or my dad sitting here, he might tell you a different story. But as a kid, that was our playground. This is where we, you know, we played and, you know, we threw bottles at each other for fun.
Yeah, well.
Because that's what we had. And, you know, we ended up actually starting a softball league. We had various softball teams, and it was started by the young people, you know, people from UBP, United Bronx Parents, and the gangs. We had a very formidable, structured softball league every summer, which was very important to us.
I grew up in Queens, in a working class neighborhood. I have a scar right by my eye here from, it wasn't a bottle, it was a rock, but yeah, that was your New York kids.
Right.
I know you were born in Vermont, you were up in Vermont.
Oh yeah.
You didn't, well, I don't know whatever you threw up there, but we were kids, yeah. It was rough and this and that. But now, as an adult now, what do you bring to this analysis or in the documentary about the politics of all of this, the economic conditions that were going on, the drugs, the lack of the political reactions or the political reactions that made things worse. And so how do you fit that all into this this narrative, along with the human?
Do you want to take that?
Sure. I mean, it is undeniable that what happened in the Bronx was a man-made catastrophe. It was not an act of nature. It wasn't. There's you know, a lot of people talk about neighborhoods, and you hear this today in the context of gentrification and inequality in the city, that, you know, that neighborhoods they kind of have a life cycle, and they're just bound to rise and fall, and it's just out of the hands of people, which is just, you know, once you start looking at the facts, is absolute fabrication. And so it was really important to like look past some of the really pernicious mythology that gets attached to the Bronx and the fires specifically in this time, because beyond this idea of like it wasn't anybody's fault is actually this idea that it was the fault of the people who lived there. And
why are they burning?
That mythology covered up a very deep and extensive structural history that created the Bronx, turned it into a ghetto, and then left it to burn really clearly. And that's really about economics and the political system that we still live in today.
Yeah, I mean, let's start with something. Cross Bronx Expressway, 1963.
Right.
What impact did that have? It destroyed the whole East Tremont area. I mean, just pushed people out. I mean, what impact did that have as a start?
Well, it isolated an entire community. It cut off an economic vibrancy, right? There were stores, there were merchants who lived there. There was housing that was good housing. It didn't have to be destroyed. And so it destroyed all of that, and it cut off not just the Cross Bronx, but where I lived, Bruckner Boulevard. It just completely isolated the other side of Southern Boulevard and Hunts Point, which, you know, then became a place for, for dark things to happen on the other side. There were no resources. It was just
you ripped the heart out of the
cut
community
off.
and the fabric.
Completely.
Shredded the social fabric.
Completely. And it just isolated us from the other side. And then it let those folks who were working in Manhattan to just drive up all the way to upstate New York and Connecticut without paying any attention to what is happening in the South Bronx. It just drove right through us.
And the issue of white flight, the enormous transition from 2/3 white, 2/3 Hispanic within 10 years. Reaction, how did that happen? How would you explain that in terms of the civil rights disruption, the migration of millions of people from Puerto Rico and Dominican Republic and the South up north as a result of the industrialization of agriculture? I mean, a lot was happening.
Right.
All this, how did the property values also begin to diminish?
So in the film, we talk about white flight as a strategy that was used to, sort of fear the people of color. So, the neighborhood is changing. There are people of color, people from Puerto Rico and the South moving into the South Bronx. And we all of a sudden see that our neighborhoods are being redlined. And we see that white folks are also being redlined.
When you're redlined, explain to our audience you're not able to get the loans, the insurance from the banks because they are choosing not to give it to certain people. So that's out and out institutional racism. So
correct.
So that's having an impact. Unemployment rates go higher and higher.
Right, and there are no resources in the neighborhood.
Right.
No resources, because what redlining does is that it does deprive a homeowner, a building owner, a business owner from any loans or any economic support to the neighborhood. And so the neighborhood begins to feel the pressure.
And the landlord specifically,
they begin to feel
see
the
that
pressure.
their investment is not bringing them a fair share return, and what do they begin to start doing?
Well, but the people there, they want to leave, right?
Yeah.
But the folks that can leave are not the people of color, because we're not eligible.
They're going
for
to the
loans.
Suburbs. The whites are flying. Flight to the suburbs.
And then what we also learned is that there was a very significant media campaign about how dangerous blacks and Puerto Ricans were living in these inner cities, and folks became afraid. They became afraid of us, right? Because that was the story that was told. Oh, look at those people. They carry knives, especially look at West Side Story, right? They're gang knife-holding people who cook their pigs on a spit outside and, are dirty.
Bonfire of the Vanities.
Right.
That sort of
and so
depiction.
That led to a fear-mongering, of people of color in the South Bronx, and people wanted to leave. People didn't want to have that, didn't want to live among folks like us.
And the actual fires themselves that start happening are a result of who's starting to do that now? There's a the fixers.
It's complicated.
It is.
It's a very complicated story.
Help us out. Because, I understand that.
There are all these these factors that led to the fires, and I can't sit here and say this is the thing that caused the epidemic. It's one thing, right? But there was a confluence of things. But what we learned, and we all we came to, those buildings were old. They were pre-war buildings, and the wiring in these buildings were not being maintained. They could not be replaced. They were not being maintained. And at the same time, you have people moving in from urban renewal, a lot more stress into the buildings, no way to upgrade. And so people, and at the same time, you have...
if I can, tell us a little about when you say urban renewal, what does that mean? The city coming in with various plans to take care of the population that now is being displaced or left?
Urban renewal was, urban renewal was never about taking care of people.
Exactly.
It was always about building a new city on top of the old city. But to do
gentrification.
that, I mean, it's kind of the precursor of gentrification today, but it was really deeply funded by the federal government and these big civic projects, and we see them all over New York today. Lincoln Center, NYU, Columbia University, you know, there's these big projects, and they built either institutions or they built middle class housing, and they built them on sites where people of color lived in Manhattan mostly. They built in some other places in New York, but mostly in Manhattan. And what Vivian mentioned is that in this era that you mentioned, from the 50s to the 60s, where the population really shifted in the Bronx, that was a time when 100,000 people were basically kicked out of their homes. Their homes were destroyed in Manhattan, and they pretty much didn't have anywhere else to go in the city except for the South Bronx. There was kind of a mass migration, and these were people who were completely like dislocated from their communities.
Co-op City started roughly when? When did that come? That was more a venture for middle class,
right?
Renters and so on, or co-op and so on. So how did that impact in terms of Section 8 housing? I mean, this gets a little complicated, but people wanted to get into Co-op City now that their housing was going, right?
And what we've often heard.
Did that accelerate some of the?
Well, just going back to urban
fires?
renewal, urban renewal was used as an excuse to get rid of the ghettos of Manhattan, to build new, refreshing housing or structures.
More lucrative ventures.
But what it did, it displaced many, many people right into the South Bronx, and so
even the
it
Yankee
wasn't
Stadium
renewal
would be
for
an
anybody.
example, refurbishing, the rebuilding of the building of the new Yankee Stadium.
Exactly.
Right, and so when Co-op City was built in 1967,
I think it opened in 69.
It opened in 69. What we often hear historians talk about was that it was just like a vacuum that sucked up all the middle class white people from the Bronx into these structures, because at that time
so the East
it was
Bronx,
very into the Northeast Bronx. It was
a
very
large
difficult.
structure, right?
Huge.
Huge, yeah.
Yeah, giant.
It's a city in and of itself. They have their own precinct, their own library, and so. You know, and at that time, it was very difficult for people of color to get an apartment into Co-op City. So again, you have, you know, like a vacuum effect of people moving into Co-op City, but the folks that remained in the South Bronx were the poor, working class, who did not have any option but to stay living in subsistence housing. Yeah.
And the gangs and the drugs begin to become part of the scene as well. The desperation, the frustration of youth. And on a positive note, also the creation of hip hop as a musical expression, a cultural expression, and graffiti. Yes, I want to bring that into the story as well here, as artistic contributions by young people to what they see around them. As positive.
We had our share of gangs. I mean, but you know, I don't know. We can talk a lot about the gangs, but the gangs were young men who had nothing else to do, and the reason why young people join gangs is because they want to feel membership into something where they feel important, where they want to have a sense of belonging. And they want to, you know, that there is a hierarchical structure, because they want structure, they want organization, they want to be able to feel like they're contributing to something. And that's why young people join gangs. It's the same reason why people joined gangs back then. And you know, there were turf issues. And of course, you know, back in the 50s and the 60s, young people needed to also form gangs to protect their own selves from being attacked by others in other neighborhoods throughout the city and in the Bronx. So, you know, you have the famous story of Bronx Tale. That was very true, right? You don't, and we've actually interviewed a lot of men of color who talked about not walking along certain parts of the Bronx by themselves because they would be attacked just for being Black or Puerto Rican. And so, these gangs were formed, and the gangs, were behaved in ways that gangs do.
Right. And a declaration of a war on crime and war on drugs, late 60s with Nixon. So and the beginnings of mass incarceration too. So you're getting it from all sides, destroying the very community that you as this adorable little 3-year-old was walking around in.
Right, but what I want to say about the gangs is that, this is just my own personal story, but the gang leader, there was a gang leader who was the super of my building. And so he took care of the building. And then when we moved to the next building, they also took care of the next building, the following building. And they protected my mom and they protected us. And they formed, like I mentioned before, a softball team. And we were I don't know whether I could say that the gang was a horrible experience for me growing up. For me, they were members of my community. We went to school with them. They went to school with us. My mother sold Avon to the girl. We also shared sugar. They weren't strangers. They were part of the community.
That's important to get out into. So, gosh, what is happening to this documentary now? You trying to get? We're going to have it at the M&M Barrio Firehouse here next week on the 13th. Tell us about how people can see this, and because I think we've whetted everybody's interest here.
Well, we are having like a series of community screenings throughout New York City.
Wow.
Really, our goal from the beginning with this project within our team of producers has always been to connect with people facing what we see as very similar issues in their community today, even though the landscape is different and the economics of displacement are different today than they are in the 70s. Back then, people were losing their homes to fire and abandonment and neglect, and today they're losing their homes because they just can't afford them anymore. And that's the places, and everybody's facing that as a crisis in this country, which doesn't seem to get much play, but it is a widespread crisis that nobody can afford to live in their housing anymore.
Not mentioned on the State of the Union.
Never, no, nobody mentions. But the people who feel this most acutely are people like in those communities, like the Bronx, who, they stood and they fought for that community. And this is part of the film, is how they saved that community. And today, the threat is them being pushed out by landlord harassment, by illegal raising of the rent, and by city policy going on that is allowing developers to, upzone, build more housing, market rate housing in extremely low-income communities without any protections for the people who live there.
So this is incredible. So you're going to these communities, showing the history 30, 40 years ago, and relating it to what they're going through today.
Right.
Brilliant.
Because
this is what exactly
displacement is happening all over.
Yes.
Right.
And we all know that in New York, but I think it's very important to connect the dots to our history in this. I mean, that's been my experience with this project, that the moment we're experiencing today of extreme inequality, extreme inaffordability, especially in housing, but also in other realms of our lives. And we're kind of, we aren't given many tools to understand why these situations are happening and what we can do as people to get something different to happen. And so I think we're really interested in helping people, connect the dots between the struggle that they're experiencing today and what people faced, 30 or 40 years ago, and how they
succeeded.
They actually won.
And won, absolutely.
Yeah, they saved the Bronx. The city wanted to give up on the Bronx. That was very clear. They pulled out firehouses, they pulled out sanitation, schools. They stopped running a lot of the trains through the Bronx. I mean, there was unofficial plans on the books to just shrink it, move people out. It was called planned shrinkage. And the reason that didn't, well, actually, it's very interesting. There's many different reasons, but the main reason is that people, they refused to give up on their neighborhoods, and these were their homes. They didn't have anywhere else to go, and they stuck together and they fought to save it, and they won. It's still there.
So you're going around to many of the churches, the social agencies. It gives what communities are you going to show the documentary?
Well, we're going to we're screening in organizations that work with residents around social justice issues and against housing injustice. Yeah, housing discrimination. And so we were at CMS,
Catholic Migration
Services last week. We're going to be here at Picture the Homeless next week. We're going to be at CASA in the Bronx, Community Action for Safe Apartments. We're going to be with Banana Kelly. They're also fighting a rezoning campaign right now. And we're going to be in Bushwick and Jamaica and Sunset Park in the next few months, and even with the Northwest Bronx Clergy Coalition, they're going to screen, because there are tenant groups all over the city, and quite frankly, I was in Pittsburgh not so long ago, who are fighting gentrification, who are fighting evictions, who are fighting unfair practices in their housing, and they're looking for inspiration, they're looking for tools, they're looking to have shared conversations about what we can do together to stop this nonsense of housing injustice.
We've just got a few more seconds to go, and we're going to end with a clip by Bobby Sanabria talking to, again, some of the same people you've been interviewing too for your documentary.
Before we go to the clip, can I also just mention that we are going to have a week run of the film at the Metrograph in the Lower East Side. It's on Ludlow Street, and it's going to be in early May. So if you can't make it to a community screening, which you can find out about on our website, which is decadeoffire.com. And if you don't catch a community screening, which you're welcome to come to the theatrical run at the Metrograph.
In May in Ludlow Street.
Yes.
You'll keep us aware on that. We're going to be at the Barrio Firehouse next week to see the documentary as well. Vivian, Gretchen, thank you so very much. This is an important, monumental documentary. We wish you all the best on this. Good luck.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you so very much. And thank you very much for watching us here on The Radical Imagination. This is Jim Vrettos. We'll see you again next week.
It's just like the most, you have these things that change your life. That's one of the things that changed my life. And I became a musician, and I've been very fortunate in this business, having traveled all over the world. And I always tell people I'm from the Bronx very proudly. And of course, those of you who are from the Bronx, if you've been fortunate enough to travel around the world, and people start asking you where you're from, you say New York. And then they go, oh, cool, And then you say, well, where are you from? And they go, the Bronx. And they go like this. And then you go, but what part of the Bronx? They go, well, the South Bronx. Oh. I'm joking, but that has actually happened to me. It happened in Paris, France, once when I was in Mongo Santa Maria and performing there. And I just wanted to remind all of you who are Bronxites, especially the young people here. These photos do not document tragedies. They document triumphs. The human spirit surviving in a time period when this city was imploding. And the thing that kept us alive was our families, the food, obviously, and the culture. No other community in New York has been as transformative as the Puerto Rican community. I sound like a preacher, but I'm inspired by these guys. No other community. When we started migrating here in mass in the 30s and 40s, we completely changed this freaking city. Culturally, food-wise, musically. That's why the Jewish people love us so much. They were the only ones that would rent to us. And when, you know, and when Mitch Miller was doing all these corny songs and everything, you know, and trying to make Frank Sinatra sing "How Much Is That Doggy in the Wind" or whatever, the Jewish community rejected all of that post-World War II corniness and said, no, you know, we're hanging where the soul music is. R&B from the black community and Latin music, is particularly Afro-Cuban music, as played by Puerto Ricans. You know, we're a very schizophrenic people, Puerto Ricans, because our music is bomba plena, the aguinaldo, seis chorrear, all that, but the music that we love the most is Afro-Cuban music. In fact, Machito used to say all the time, oye, ¿tú quieres que te toque la música cubana bien? Búscate un puertorriqueño de Nueva York. Which translates into English as, oye, ¿tú quieres que te... So the moral of the story is, if you took French in high school, you should have taken up Spanish. And if you did take Spanish, you should have been paying attention.